To start off by talking about ovarian aging and ovarian reserve tests. And I'm going to start with a little bit of very elementary developmental embryology and physiology, followed by some history, and then we'll talk a little bit about ovarian reserve tests. Around the 6th to 7th week of intrauterine life or gestational age, primordial germ cells in the wall of the yolk sac migrate towards the genital ridge, and that is where the primitive gonad will reside. In the absence of a Y chromosome, ovaries are formed, and the primordial germ cells are changed into oogonia, and the oogonia multiply by mitosis up to the 20th week of gestation. And during this process, the oogonia also undergo other changes to become more development to become the primary oocyte. And it's, in a way, it's like a Chrysler conveyor belt, that the earlier oogonia are the ones that become the earlier primary oocytes that are then ovulated earlier. And please remember that as I come to the end of my talk. And this process goes on up to 20 weeks gestation. The primary oocyte is arrested at the prophase of the first meiotic division, and in fact that first meiotic division isn't completed until after the LH surge with ovulation. Meiosis 1 is then completed at that time, and the secondary oocyte is arrested in the metaphase of the second meiotic division, and of course you have the first polar body at the end of the first process. And the meiosis 2 is actually completed after fertilization of the oocyte and then extrusion of the second polar body. And just a diagram from a recent paper showing the, again, the germinal vesicle intact oocyte, spindle formation, completion of meiosis 1 with extrusion of the first polar body. Fertilization leads to completion of meiosis 2, and then you have the two pronuclear stage, the pronuclear stage, and the two polar bodies. Now, by the process of mitosis and then change into the primary oocyte, by the 20th week of gestation, there are about 7 million oocytes, and many of them undergo atresia, such that at birth there's only about 1 million, at puberty about 400,000, and during an individual's lifespan, if you do some calculation, about 500 of these follicles that develop are actually ovulated. And this is schematically represented here. And of course, we don't talk about hormonal activity in a 6-year-old because, as you well know, the neuroendocrine axis that controls the ovarian cycle is quiescent. At puberty, it wakes up and remains actually active way until old age. But at menopause, the germ cell content is depleted, and so the neuroendocrine axis becomes more active. That's why the woman has her hot flashes and night sweats. And during these reproductive years, as you are well aware, we have these classic menstrual cycles with development of the follicle, production of estradiol, the mid-cycle gonadotropin surge, the release of the oocyte out of the ovary and into the fallopian tubes, the cells that remain behind form the corpus luteum, which then produces progesterone, and the corpus luteum has a lifespan of about 2 weeks, and when it undergoes luteolysis, the endometrium, which has hitherto been supported by both estrogen and progesterone, is no longer supported, and the woman has her period. And I'd like to concentrate for a minute on the luteal-follicular transition, and as you can see, as the corpus luteum comes to an end, estradiol declines, progesterone declines, inhibin A levels, which are produced by the corpus luteum, decline, and the neuroendocrine axis, in particular FSH, is activated, pushing into the next cycle a bunch of follicles, out of which then one is recruited to become dominant. And this was very well written up by Dr. Messinas in Greece, the luteal-follicular transition, decreasing estradiol, progesterone, and in particular inhibin A lead to increased FSH and open the FSH window, allowing the growth of a cohort of follicles from which the dominant follicle is selected. And once you've selected the dominant follicle, that cycle is underway. Forget about everything else. The events of the cycle will take over and become the dominant feature of the time. But what we don't talk about very much is what about this cohort of follicles? Is this a big cohort, a medium-sized cohort, a small cohort? How does it vary from cycle to cycle? How does it vary from person to person or over an individual's lifetime? And again, I'd like to just concentrate on here the line representing Menzies. And as I've already indicated, FSH is up in the early part of the cycle, which is absolutely classic. But how high it's up depends on that cohort. If that cohort that is trying to develop, out of which only one is selected to be dominant, is large, those antral follicles, small antral follicles, produce inhibin B, and that inhibin keeps a lid on that FSH, so it doesn't go wildly elevated. But if that cohort of follicles is small, there's less inhibin, and therefore FSH will increase further. And that is the basis of one of the tests that we do for ovarian reserve. So, stated differently, women with good ovarian reserve have a sufficient production of hormones such as inhibin B from many small follicles early in the cycle to keep a lid on that FSH. In contrast, women with a reduced pool of follicles and oocytes have a decreased inhibin B secretion from the preantral follicles, and this loss of inhibition leads to increased FSH in the early follicular phase, more rapid follicular development because you're pushing things forward quickly, and shortening of the cycles, which is classic of the later reproductive years. And so these measures of so-called reserve, which is what I will talk about for the next few minutes, attempt to quantify the reproductive potential by estimating the number of remaining oocytes. And again, I just want to repeat again that the amount of inhibin B in the early part of the cycle relates to the size of the cohort, so the lower the number of follicles that are trying to develop, the lower the inhibin and the higher the FSH. So in regularly menstruating women, fertility rises to a maximum in the early 20s. Actually, all of this came about in 1978 after Louise Brown, the first in vitro fertilization baby, was born. And infertility, as we know it, was kind of put on the map at that time. People didn't talk about it as much. And after that, of course, the literature has exploded. So again, I repeat, in regularly menstruating a woman, fertility rises to a maximum during her early 20s, it decreases after age 30, and is greatly reduced after age 36. This was a study published, a demographic study in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1982. By the early 80s, Dr. Howard and Georgiana Jones set up the first in vitro fertilization program in the United States. And there's still a very famous program, even though both have actually died since then. And what they observed, and they wrote this up in a paper in 1986, is that in older patients undergoing in vitro fertilization, it was noted that parameters of perimenopause were low estradiol response to gonadotropins, early luteinization, we didn't even have Lutron in those days, or Lutrolide in those days, and an increased FSH to LH ratio. These were the hallmarks, if you like, of early aging. And the following year, Dr. Nabat published this paper about clomiphene challenge. The argument was as follows. We know that clomiphene is an anti-estrogen. It stimulates the hypothalamic GnRH pulsatility, favoring the production of both LH and FSH. And Dr. Nabat argued that maybe we could emphasize these differences between the younger women and the older women if we gave them clomiphene. And what he showed was that in 51 women aged 35 or more, 1/3 had an exaggerated FSH response, exactly what he was looking for. And follow-up showed that there was decreased pregnancy rates in these women as compared with those that didn't have an exaggerated FSH response. So I was very excited. This was the early days for me of being a reproductive endocrine. I was very excited in this. So we actually, many years ago, as I said, this is just all history. Well, we did clomiphene challenge tests in 20 women that were young, 18 to 25, and 20 women who were 35 to 40. And in this particular small group, the baseline hormonal concentrations were not actually that different. But there was a higher FSH response in the older women after the clomiphene, just as you would expect. And a subgroup exhibited FSH hyperresponsiveness, doubling or more than 10. Only one belonged to the younger group, and the other 7 belonged to group 2, confirming what we already thought. And in these women, the estradiol change was lower, and in 7 out of the 8, the change in FSH was greater than the change in LH, which was only seen in 2 of the remaining 32 women. And then we asked ourselves the question, is this just a fluke response, or can you repeat it? So we did something else that was crazy. We did repetitive clomiphene challenge tests in 20 women who deliberately were chosen to be older to see whether we could reproduce this each time. And despite some variation, the hormonal response of a subject could usually be categorized as one or other of the spectrum of ovarian function, signifying good or poor reserve. In fact, out of those 20 subjects, only 3 had both good and bad responses to clomiphene. The other 17 fell into this category or that category. Kind of a proof of concept, if you like. So, if you want to read a good paper for the younger audience on ovarian reserve test, this is not a bad one, it's a good one to read. And I just want to emphasize here that we sort of, what figures do we use? A day 3 FSH, because we're trying to catch FSH at its peak. A day 3 FSH has a high specificity, but relatively poor sensitivity in predicting poor response to stimulation. The clomiphene challenge test, and I forgot to mention, we give 100 milligrams for 5 days. A higher day 10 after the clomiphene FSH suggests decreased reserve, as I've said, and this challenge test has a higher sensitivity but a lower specificity. Well, what do we have to say about this all these years later? This was many years ago. Well, meta-analysis of non-randomized studies concluded The day 3 FSH and clomiphene challenge test performed similarly for predicting the ability to achieve pregnancy in women undergoing infertility treatment, which is why we don't use and we have other tests too now, of course. We don't use the clomiphene challenge test much anymore. Normal results are not very helpful in predicting fertility, but a highly abnormal result, such as an FSH of greater than 20, suggests that pregnancy is unlikely to occur with treatment involving the woman's own oocytes, particularly if she is of more advanced reproductive age. And it's been suggested that a day 3 FSH less than 10 represents an adequate reserve, and 10 to 15 is a borderline reserve, if you want the number to use. So, over the last decade, anti-Müllerian hormone has become a very important test of ovarian reserve. And AMH is a member of the TGF-beta family secreted by the granulosa cells of the preantral and early antral follicles. It declines with age, and generally speaking, values of less than 0.7 nanograms per ml have been correlated with decreased fecundability in natural cycles and poor response to stimulation in assisted reproduction. One of the important things about AMH is it's unaffected by cycle day. You don't have to do it on day 3 of the cycle as you do with FSH. You can do it at any time of the cycle. And values of 0.2 to 0.7 have a sensitivity of 40 to 90% and specificity of 78 to 92% in predicting poor ovarian response to ovarian stimulation. And however, this is a big, big, big caveat and however, and I'm going to show you 2 papers that illustrate this point, that be very cautious about interpreting AMH levels in the younger woman. That's what these 2 papers are about. And this study by Lin et al. Was to determine if the level of serum AMH is related to early ovarian aging in young women, less than the age of 35. What does it mean if you have a low AMH at age 30? So they took 70 women with what they called a low AMH, which in their study they defined as less than 2, and 104 with AMH that were greater than 2, to see if they performed differently. And remember, all of them were less than 35 years of age. And all of them had in vitro fertilization and intracytoplasmic sperm injection, and the clinical pregnancy rate per transfer, live birth rate, and perinatal outcomes were all comparable between the 2 groups. In other words, those with a low AMH didn't do any worse than those with a high AMH by and large in terms of pregnancy rate. However, the cancellation rate was higher in those that had the low AMH. In other words, the doctor, like Dr. Vallejo, was not happy with the response, so he said, come back again next cycle and I'm going to stimulate you in a different way. So there was a higher cancellation rate in those that had the lower AMH. And the conclusions of the authors is our results suggest that low serum AMH may suggest early ovarian aging in accelerated oocyte loss only, but may not fully represent early ovarian aging based on the favorable outcomes of pregnancy. Very important. And another similar study from Germany with over 1,000 women spanning the ages of 21 to 44. They were analyzed retrospectively in an IVF-ICSI program. And of course, we all know higher AMH levels corresponded broadly to higher pregnancy rates, and patients with higher AMH had less or lower cancellation rates, as we already know, and a higher number of oocytes retrieved. However, AMH did not influence pregnancy rates in patients who were less than 36 years of age. Again, a word of caution. Just don't tell a patient that if you have low AMH, if she's 32 years old, that she's not going to get pregnant, because that is not correct. So the conclusion again was in younger patients, AMH levels do not predict pregnancy outcomes. In patients older than 36, AMH can be used as a prognostic factor, but even when a woman's AMH levels are too low to be detectable, she still has some chance of getting pregnant, but that is age dependent. And this is shown, this is a graph from their paper, and if you look at the very low AMH levels, look at the differences in pregnancy rates according to the age. So age makes a difference, it's not just AMH. Very briefly, antral follicle count, which Professor Flehos is going to talk about, is also a test of ovarian reserve, because as I've just said many times, the more the follicles, the better your reserve. And this was histologically correlated with primordial follicles, and a low antral follicle count may predict the patient who may have a poor response to stimulation. You're going to hear about that. And in this study, which came out last year, 4 different ovarian reserve markers were looked at per started IVF ICSI cycle in over 1,000 women. And AMH, antral follicle count, combination of basal FSH and LH, menstrual cycle lengths were analyzed for correlation and treatment outcomes. All the reserve tests correlated significantly with each other. The highest correlation was between the antral follicle count and AMH. Univariately, AMH and age equivalently predicted live birth. Together, they provided a statistically better model. AMH, antral follicle count, and age together provided the best model to predict poor and excessive response. And again, this is a summary of the paper that I asked you to look at for the younger audience, but I'd like to concentrate on just the last two sentences. These tests that I've just been talking about, do not reflect oocyte quality. And the risk of aneuploidy, as I'll show you, is driven by maternal age, not ovarian reserve per se. And patients more than 35 without conception after 6 months should go and see Professor Flehos for his help, or patients with diminished ovarian reserve, it would be reasonable to go and see an infertility specialist as opposed to your gynecologist. Now, this is a paper that came out last year, and I thought it was one of the most interesting papers that I have read, and it made me understand things that I have not understood for 30 years. So I just want to summarize it. Maternal age provides the best predictor of oocyte quality and embryo developmental capacity, but of course, there's also wide variation from person to person. One patient may sort of have be older at age 38, another one at age 42 or 43. So there is a variation. So what Dr. Keith et al. Talked about in this brief paper or review were the processes implicated in age-related oocyte dysfunction. And they listed the things that could be affected. Mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondrial genome is highly sensitive to reactive oxygen species and genotoxic damage, and prolonged arrest in prophase may lead to accumulated damage. Remember, if you're 20 years old and you get pregnant, you use the first few oocytes that are being developed. But if you're 39 years old and you get pregnant, you have waited another 19 years, and that oocyte has remained arrested in prophase 1 for that duration of time. And they talk about age in terms of aneuploidy, meiotic spindle dysfunction. The spindle apparatus separates chromosomes in meiosis 1 and the sister chromatids in meiosis 2, as we know, leading to aneuploidy in either stage. In those over 40, 80% of the oocytes exhibit abnormal spindle, whereas in those less than 25, only 20% do so. So this is very important. This is what I showed you previously with the spindle formation. And obviously, the older you are, the more free radicals you produce. They talk about cohesins that prevent premature chromatin separation in meiosis 1 and may be disrupted with age. They talk about genomic instability. As I said, the frequency of aneuploidy in pre-implantation embryos increases markedly with maternal age. And then this was extremely interesting, and you'll see it on the next slide. The telomere attrition. Telomeres are repetitive sequences of DNA that camp and protect the chromosome ends and are lost over the course of an organism's lifespan. And this triggers senescence, apoptosis, and genomic instability, as you know. And they proposed a telomere theory of reproductive aging. And here's what they said. They suggested that there were 2 hits to the telomeres in the germline of women that contribute to reproductive aging. In early development, when the telomeres are sensitive to attrition during the mitotic process, the more mitosis you have, the more likely you have to have some telomere attrition. And as I've just said, the prolonged interval between the germ cell formation and ovulation, when reactive oxygen species, inevitable byproducts of metabolism of living cells, further shorten the telomeres. And they very interestingly suggest that maybe we should be using the polar body biopsy to determine as a biomarker the health of that individual oocyte. And again, I want to go back to a slide that I have shown you previously, that the more mitosis you have in this process, the more likely you are to have the telomere attrition. And also, because this is like a Chrysler conveyor belt where the first cars that come out are the first ones that are sold, if you like, the longer the time that oocyte spends suspended in prophase of the first meiotic division, the more likely it is to have a telomere production, a telomere attrition, and they suggest that if we could biopsy the polar body, we may be able to get some information about the quality of that oocyte. Thank you very much.